March 17, 1945. Jagdgeschwader 27 airfield, somewhere in the fractured remains of Western Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Brenner stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching mechanics push his Focke-Wulf 190 into position for what would be his final combat sortie. 17 confirmed kills decorated his service record. The Knight's Cross hung at his throat. Yet his hands trembled as he climbed into the cockpit, and it wasn't from the cold. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, his wingman Heinrich Möller had returned from a patrol over the Rhine with his aircraft riddled by holes so large you could see daylight through the fuselage. Möller, a veteran of 73 combat missions, had encountered something that shattered his legendary composure. He refused to describe the aircraft that attacked him, saying only that its silhouette against the sun looked like death itself, and that the sound of its engine would haunt him until his grave. That afternoon, Möller walked into the commander's office and requested immediate transfer to ground duties. His request was denied. 2 hours later, he was found in the latrine with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his left hand. The injury was severe enough to ground him permanently. The investigation ruled it accidental discharge during weapon cleaning. Everyone knew better. Brenner wasn't alone in his dread. Across German airfields in those final months of the war, a peculiar phenomenon was occurring that military historians would spend decades trying to fully document. Pilots with impeccable records were developing sudden illnesses before missions. Aircraft were being reported as mechanically unsound at rates that exceeded statistical probability. Some men simply vanished, deserting rather than face what awaited them in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe's high command issued increasingly desperate orders threatening courts-martial for cowardice, but fear cannot be legislated away. These men, the cream of German aviation, hardened by years of combat against Spitfires, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Yaks, had encountered something that broke them in ways enemy fire never could. They had seen the Corsair. But more than seeing it, they had survived it, and survival meant living with the knowledge of what it could do. The fear wasn't of death. Fighter pilots made peace with mortality in their first combat. The fear was of something more primal, the realization that they were no longer apex predators but prey, hunted by a machine that seemed designed by engineers who understood not just aerodynamics, but psychology, terror, and the breaking point of the human spirit. The story of why Germany's finest aviators came to fear one aircraft above all others begins not in the skies over Europe, but in a design office in Connecticut, where engineers grappled with problems that would inadvertently create the most psychologically devastating fighter of the Second World War. The Chance Vought Corporation received specification requests from the United States Navy in February 1938 for a carrier-based fighter that could outperform anything currently flying. The requirements seemed contradictory: maximum speed and climb rate in an aircraft that could land on a carrier deck. Lead designer Rex Beisel and his team faced a fundamental challenge. The most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, generated over 2,000 horsepower, but required a propeller so large it would strike the carrier deck during landing. The solution Beisel devised would inadvertently create the Corsair's most psychologically devastating feature. Rather than compromise on propeller diameter, he designed inverted gull wings that angled sharply downward from the fuselage before leveling out. This cranked wing design allowed the landing gear to be shorter while keeping the massive propeller clear of the ground. The configuration was aerodynamically efficient, reducing drag where the wing met the fuselage. But it also created a silhouette unlike anything else in the sky, a profile that would become instantly recognizable and utterly terrifying to those who faced it in combat. The first prototype, designated XF-4U1, flew on May 29, 1940, from Stratford, Connecticut. Test pilot Lyman A. Bullard pushed the aircraft to 405 miles per hour during its fifth flight, making it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The performance was staggering, but the aircraft had problems. Visibility from the cockpit was poor due to the long nose and the cockpit's position far aft on the fuselage. The landing characteristics were treacherous, with a tendency to stall without warning and drop a wing violently. The bounce and swerve on carrier decks proved so dangerous that the Navy initially rejected it for carrier operations, relegating it to land-based Marine squadrons. What the Navy saw as fatal flaws, the Marines saw as acceptable trade-offs for devastating performance. The first Marine squadron to receive Corsairs, VMF-124, began training in September 1942 at Camp Kearney near San Diego. The squadron's commanding officer, Major William Guise, recognized immediately that the aircraft's reputation would be a weapon itself if properly cultivated. He encouraged his pilots to exploit every intimidating aspect of the design. The inverted gull wings gave the Corsair a predatory appearance, like a bird of prey stooping on its target. The massive engine cowling dominated the forward fuselage, suggesting raw power barely contained. The air intake beneath the engine looked like a gaping mouth. Even stationary on the ramp, the aircraft projected menace. But it was the sound that would become the Corsair's most effective psychological weapon, an unintended consequence of design choices made for purely practical reasons. The R2800 engine breathed through a supercharger system that produced a distinctive whistle at certain power settings. The propeller tips, moving at supersonic speeds during high-speed dives, created a sound unlike any other aircraft. Pilots described it as a scream, a howl, a banshee wail that announced the Corsair's presence long before visual contact. Japanese soldiers on Pacific Islands learned to recognize that sound and dive for cover. German soldiers would soon learn the same terror. VMF-124 deployed to the Solomon Islands in February 1943, beginning the Corsair's combat career against Japanese forces. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The aircraft's performance advantage was immediate and overwhelming. It could outclimb, outdive, and outrun everything Japan had in the air. The kill ratios quickly became lopsided. In the hands of capable pilots, the Corsair was nearly invincible in air combat. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence reports were warning pilots to avoid engagement with the bent-wing fighter unless possessing overwhelming numerical advantage. Some Japanese pilots, upon identifying Corsairs, would jettison their bombs and flee without engaging. The success in the Pacific caught the attention of Allied commanders planning operations in Europe. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign over Germany was suffering unsustainable losses. American B-17 and B-24 bombers flying daylight raids were being mauled by Luftwaffe interceptors. The P-47 Thunderbolt provided excellent escort when present, but lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. The P-51 Mustang would eventually solve the range problem, but in late 1943 was still working through developmental issues. The British Royal Navy had been operating Corsairs from carriers since April 1943 with considerable success. Their experience suggested the aircraft might be effective in the European theater despite its initial design for Pacific operations. In November 1943, the first Corsairs arrived in England, assigned to Royal Navy squadrons operating from escort carriers in the Atlantic and from land bases in support of planned operations in Northern Europe. The Royal Navy had solved many of the carrier landing problems that plagued early American operations by modifying the approach technique and cutting down the aft fuselage slightly to improve visibility. British pilots found the aircraft's performance intoxicating. Flight Lieutenant James Crawford of 1830 Naval Air Squadron wrote in his log, "The Corsair doesn't fly so much as it attacks the sky. Everything about it suggests violence barely restrained. You don't taxi this aircraft, you aim it. You don't take off, you're released like an arrow from a bow." The Luftwaffe first encountered Corsairs in action during Operation Steinbock, the German revenge bombing campaign against London that began in January 1944. British Corsairs, operating as night fighters from land bases, intercepted German bombers over the English Channel with devastating effectiveness. The Corsair's high speed and excellent high-altitude performance made it ideal for intercepting the Ju-88 and E-111 bombers attempting to strike London under cover of darkness. But it was the daytime encounters that began to build the Corsair's fearsome reputation among German pilots. In February 1944, Corsairs from Fleet Air Arm squadrons began flying escort missions for RAF bombers attacking targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. Luftwaffe units scrambled to intercept and countered an aircraft completely unlike the Spitfires and Typhoons they had grown accustomed to fighting. The performance differential was shocking. FW-190 pilots, flying what had been Germany's best fighter when introduced in 1941, found themselves comprehensively outclassed. The Corsair could outclimb them by 1,000 feet per minute. It could outdive them by 100 miles per hour. In turning combat, the Corsair's superior power-to-weight ratio meant it could maintain energy in maneuvers that would bleed speed from German fighters. But raw performance statistics don't capture what made the Corsair psychologically devastating. Combat is chaos, adrenaline, and terror compressed into seconds where rational thought gives way to instinct and training. In that crucible, the Corsair exploited every fear hardwired into human survival instincts. Its appearance triggered predator recognition responses developed over millions of years of evolution. The bent wings resembled a raptor's silhouette. The dark blue paint scheme used by most Navy and Marine squadrons made it difficult to spot against cloud or sky until it was already attacking. The long nose and bubble canopy gave it an insectoid appearance that registered as alien and threatening. The sound completed the psychological assault. German pilots who survived Corsair attacks consistently mentioned the sound in their combat reports. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, a veteran with 28 confirmed kills, filed a report after an encounter over Normandy in March 1944 that captured the visceral terror. "We were climbing to intercept a formation of Lancasters when I heard it, a sound like tearing metal mixed with the scream of a diving Stuka, but higher pitched, more urgent. I looked up and saw 6 aircraft diving on us from the sun. The silhouette was unmistakable, inverted gull wings, long nose, the shape of death itself. My wingman broke left immediately, instinctive panic rather than tactical decision. I tried to turn into the attack, but they were so fast, impossibly fast. One passed within meters of my canopy, the sound so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. I managed to evade long enough to dive into cloud cover, but my aircraft was damaged by fragments from my wingman's fighter, which had been blown apart in the first pass." Stigler's wingman, Lieutenant Peter Hoffmann, did not survive. His FW-190 was found crashed in a field near Cannes, the wreckage pattern suggesting it had been struck by multiple .50 caliber rounds and disintegrated in midair. Hoffmann had been a skilled pilot with 15 kills and 18 months of combat experience. He was 22 years old. The after-action report filed by the British Corsair pilot who made the kill, Sub-Lieutenant Robert Hampton of 1841 Squadron, noted clinically that the enemy aircraft had not attempted effective defensive maneuvers and appeared to have been caught completely by surprise despite clear conditions and adequate warning of the attack. What Hampton's report couldn't capture was the German pilot's perspective, the moment of recognition when Hoffmann identified the aircraft attacking him and knew, with absolute certainty, that he was already dead. That moment of psychological paralysis, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, was enough. In air combat, 2 seconds is an eternity. It's the difference between evasive action and flying straight while the enemy lines up a perfect deflection shot. The Corsair's reputation was creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Pilots who had heard the stories, who knew what the bent-wing fighter could do, suffered decision paralysis at the crucial moment. The fear killed them before the bullets arrived. By April 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence had compiled enough combat reports to recognize a disturbing pattern. Pilots engaging Corsairs were dying at rates significantly higher than encounters with other Allied fighters of comparable performance. The P-51 Mustang had similar speed and better range. The P-47 Thunderbolt could outdive anything and had devastating firepower. The Spitfire Mark IX could turn inside most German fighters. Yet pilots survived encounters with these aircraft at much higher rates than Corsair engagements. The statistical discrepancy suggested something beyond mechanical capability was at work. Luftwaffe psychologists, yes, the German military employed psychologists to study combat stress and morale, were consulted. Their analysis, preserved in fragmentary reports recovered after the war, identified what they termed recognition paralysis. Pilots who had survived previous Corsair encounters, or who had been briefed by survivors, developed anticipatory fear responses. The distinctive silhouette or sound triggered fight or flight reactions that overwhelmed training. In the confined cockpit of a fighter aircraft at 25,000 feet, flight wasn't an option, and fighting effectively required calm execution of practiced maneuvers. Panic made skilled pilots fly like beginners, making fatal mistakes that experienced aviators knew to avoid. The psychological impact wasn't limited to the air. Pilots waiting at readiness, knowing Corsairs were operating in their sector, showed measurable stress responses. Ground crews reported pilots vomiting before missions, something rarely seen even among green replacement pilots. The maintenance officers began receiving an unusual number of reports about aircraft malfunctions, problems that investigation often revealed were either non-existent or grossly exaggerated. Pilots were finding excuses not to fly, and the excuses were becoming increasingly transparent. Commodore Friedrich Lang of Jagdgeschwader II faced a morale crisis by May 1944. His unit, stationed near Paris and tasked with intercepting Allied aircraft attacking French infrastructure in preparation for the invasion everyone knew was coming, had lost 18 pilots in 3 weeks. 7 of those losses came in a single engagement with Corsairs from 3 Royal Navy squadrons escorting a bombing raid against railway yards at Amiens. The kill ratio was devastating, 7 German fighters destroyed for no Corsair losses. But it was the aftermath that troubled Lang more than the numbers. The surviving pilots from that engagement were shattered. 2 requested immediate transfer to transport duties. 1, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Werner, a steady veteran with 31 kills, began drinking heavily and was found passed out in his quarters at midday. When confronted, Werner broke down, describing in halting words the moment his entire flight was bounced by Corsairs that seemed to materialize from nowhere, the sound that paralyzed him, the sight of his comrades' aircraft exploding, the certainty of his own death as tracer rounds walked up his fuselage, missing him by pure chance. Werner survived only because his aircraft's damage forced him to bail out. He landed in a forest and spent 6 hours walking back to base, during which time he decided he could not return to that sky, could not face that sound again, could not overcome the fear that seized him when he thought about climbing back into a cockpit. Lang faced an impossible situation. He couldn't ground every pilot who showed fear, his squadron would cease to exist. He couldn't ignore the problem, terrified pilots made fatal mistakes. His solution, documented in a letter to Luftwaffe High Command dated May 23, 1944, was to request specialized training for countering the Corsairs specifically. The request was approved, and in early June, a technical intelligence officer arrived at the base with captured gun camera footage, performance data compiled from wreckage analysis, and tactical recommendations. The briefing took place in a converted barn that served as the squadron's ready room. 32 pilots attended, everyone currently on flight status. The intelligence officer, Major Dieter Hoffmann, a staff officer who had never flown combat, began by acknowledging what everyone in the room already knew. The Corsair was killing them at unsustainable rates. Then he made a mistake that revealed how disconnected headquarters had become from frontline reality. He suggested the solution was simply better tactics and maintaining aggressive spirit. A pilot in the back row, whose name is lost to history but whose outburst was recorded in multiple diaries, stood up and shouted that Hoffmann had no idea what he was talking about. The officer had never heard that sound, never seen that silhouette diving out of the sun, never felt the paralysis that seized your hands on the controls when you knew you were facing something that could kill you before you could react. Other pilots joined in, voices rising, describing encounters where all the tactical training in the world meant nothing when the enemy had such overwhelming advantages in speed, climb, and firepower that engagement itself was suicide. Lang restored order, but the damage was done. The briefing continued, but every pilot in that room now knew that their leadership had no solution, just platitudes about courage and duty. The gun camera footage showed Corsairs executing maneuvers that seemed physically impossible, rolling rates that no German fighter could match, energy retention in vertical maneuvers that defied understanding. The performance data confirmed what they'd learned through bitter experience. In every measurable category except possibly turn radius at specific speeds, the Corsair was superior. The tactical recommendations boiled down to avoid engagement unless holding every possible advantage, advice that was tactically sound but strategically worthless when your mission required intercepting enemy aircraft regardless of circumstances. 3 days after that briefing, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. Corsairs appeared over the beaches in numbers that shocked German commanders. Fleet air-armed squadrons flew from carriers offshore. Marine squadrons operated from hastily prepared airstrips in England. The distinctive bent-wing silhouette became ubiquitous in Norman skies, and Luftwaffe losses climbing to intercept became catastrophic. In the first week of June 1944, Jagdgeschwader II lost 23 aircraft in combat. 14 of those losses came in encounters with Corsairs. Lang's squadron was being destroyed, not gradually worn down, but systematically eliminated by an opponent that seemed to hunt them with almost casual efficiency. The pilots who survived those first weeks developed a grim fatalism. They knew the statistics. They understood that every mission reduced their odds of survival. Some sought escape through injury, minor accidents that grounded them temporarily. Others simply stopped caring, flying with reckless aggression that bordered on suicide, perhaps hoping for a quick death rather than the prolonged terror of waiting for the inevitable. A few, a very few, developed techniques that increased survival odds marginally. These methods spread through informal networks, whispered conversations in dispersal areas, advice passed between squadrons. The most effective survival tactic was simple recognition and evasion. If you spotted Corsairs before they saw you, dive immediately for ground level and stay there, using terrain and the aircraft's poor low-altitude maneuverability to escape. Never, under any circumstances, attempt to climb against them. Never try to outdive them. Never assume you can outrun them in level flight. If caught in the open by a diving Corsair, the only option was violent barrel rolls combined with split-S maneuvers, burning energy and altitude to break the attack geometry, then running for cloud cover or the deck. These tactics sometimes worked. More often, they simply delayed death by seconds. Lieutenant Gunther Rall, who had survived the war with 275 confirmed kills, the third highest scoring ace in history, encountered Corsairs twice over Normandy in June 1944. His description of those encounters, recorded in his post-war memoir, captured both the aircraft's lethality and the psychological impact of facing it. I had fought Russians in Yaks and Lavochkins that could turn inside anything we had. I had fought British Spitfires that could climb with us and outmaneuver us. I had fought American Thunderbolts that could dive away from anything and had firepower that could saw a fighter in half. But the Corsair was different. It had all the advantages and none of the weaknesses. Fighting it wasn't combat, it was execution delayed only by the skill needed to set up the killing shot. Rall survived his encounters through a combination of situational awareness, excellent reflexes, and luck. Both times he spotted the Corsairs early enough to evade, diving away and using his superior low-altitude speed to escape. He noted that many pilots lacked his experience or his almost supernatural ability to spot threats early. For them, the first indication of a Corsair's presence was often the sound, that distinctive howl, followed milliseconds later by tracer rounds converging on their position. By then, survival was a matter of chance rather than skill. The Luftwaffe's technical intelligence teams managed to examine several crashed Corsairs during the summer of 1944, analyzing the wreckage to understand what made the aircraft so formidable. What they discovered was both impressive and demoralizing. The Corsair wasn't a revolutionary design, it was simply an optimization of known principles executed with American industrial precision and powered by an engine that represented the absolute state-of-the-art in aviation technology. The R2800 Double Wasp was a masterpiece of engineering, 18 cylinders producing over 2,000 horsepower with remarkable reliability. German engines of comparable power, the DB603 and Jumo 213, were temperamental, prone to failure, and never produced in sufficient numbers. The airframe construction revealed American manufacturing capability that Germany could no longer match. Aluminum alloys of exceptional quality, precision machining evident in every component, redundant systems that allowed the aircraft to sustain massive damage and continue flying. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, armor plate protected the pilot from multiple angles, the control systems had backup mechanisms. Everything about the design reflected a philosophy of keeping the pilot alive even when the aircraft was catastrophically damaged. German fighters, designed when aluminum was scarce and manufacturing capacity limited, made compromises that the Corsair simply didn't have to make. The weapons systems were particularly devastating. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, provided firepower that could destroy any aircraft with a 1-second burst. The 50 caliber round was heavy enough to penetrate armor and powerful enough to cause catastrophic structural damage. Gun camera footage recovered from crashed Corsairs showed German fighters literally coming apart under fire, wings separating, fuselages breaking in half, engines torn from mounts. The Americans had developed incendiary and armor-piercing rounds that made every bullet a potential kill shot. German pilots learned that even a glancing hit from a Corsair could be fatal. But the technical analysis, while thorough, missed the fundamental reason why the Corsair was so psychologically devastating. It wasn't just one superior characteristic, it was the combination of multiple advantages that created an opponent that couldn't be countered through any single tactical adjustment. Fast opponents could be avoided through careful positioning. Heavily armed opponents could be evaded through superior maneuverability. Well-protected opponents could be engaged with patience and precision. The Corsair was fast and heavily armed and well-protected and highly maneuverable and flown by pilots who were increasingly skilled and aggressive. There was no tactical counter, no technical solution, no training that could overcome such comprehensive superiority. By August 1944, Luftwaffe squadrons in France were being systematically destroyed. The fighter pilots who had dominated European skies for years were being hunted almost casually by Allied fighters that operated with impunity. The Corsair was just one of several excellent Allied fighters contributing to German losses, but it had assumed an outsized role in pilot psychology. The distinctive appearance and sound made it memorable in ways that more conventional fighters were not. Pilots who survived multiple combats remembered their Corsair encounters with particular clarity, the fear etching those memories deeper than other experiences. The psychological impact began manifesting in unexpected ways. Pilots reported hearing the Corsair's distinctive howl during quiet moments on the ground, auditory hallucinations triggered by stress and fear. Some developed startle responses to any unexpected noise, diving for cover when trucks backfired or tools dropped. Sleep disturbances became epidemic, pilots waking from nightmares of being pursued by bent-wing shadows that caught them no matter how desperately they maneuvered. The Luftwaffe medical officers, overwhelmed by the volume of psychological casualties, had no effective treatments beyond temporary rest and transfers to less stressful duties when possible. The collapse of German forces in France following the Normandy breakout forced wholesale retreats eastward. Luftwaffe units abandoned equipment and fell back to airfields in Germany itself, where they reformed and attempted to rebuild strength. But the psychological damage couldn't be repaired through rest and refit. The pilots who had faced Corsairs over France brought their fear back to Germany, spreading it through conversations and combat reports that painted a picture of an opponent that couldn't be beaten through any conventional means. New pilots arriving at squadrons in autumn 1944 received informal briefings from veterans that were more terrifying than any enemy propaganda. They learned which aircraft to fear most, and the Corsair topped every list. They heard stories of entire flights being wiped out in seconds, of pilots who froze on the controls when they heard that sound, of friends who simply vanished in fireballs so sudden there was no time for radio calls. These stories, told in quiet voices during evening hours when the day's losses were being counted, created anticipatory dread in men who had not yet seen combat. The fundamental problem facing the Luftwaffe by late 1944 was no longer primarily technical or tactical, it was psychological. They were asking men to fly aircraft they knew were inferior against opponents they knew were better trained, better equipped, and operating with complete air superiority. Every mission was increasingly likely to be fatal. Every takeoff might be the last. That knowledge, that mathematical certainty of eventual death, broke even experienced pilots. When one particular aircraft came to symbolize that inevitable defeat, when its appearance triggered not just tactical concerns but existential dread, resistance collapsed. the Corsair's role in the European theater remained relatively limited compared to the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt, which flew the majority of escort and ground attack missions. But its impact on German pilot morale was disproportionate to its numbers. Intelligence intercepts, decoded Enigma messages, and prisoner interrogations all revealed the same pattern. German pilots feared the Corsair in ways they didn't fear other Allied fighters, even those of equal or superior performance. The fear was irrational in pure military terms but completely understandable in human terms. The Corsair looked dangerous, sounded terrifying, and killed with casual efficiency. It was the perfect embodiment of Allied material superiority and German defeat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a highly decorated ace who would survive the war with 176 confirmed kills, wrote in his memoirs about the psychological burden of the final months. We were fighting not just enemy aircraft but our own knowledge of futility. Every veteran pilot understood the mathematics of attrition. The Allies could lose 5 aircraft for every one of ours and still win through sheer numbers. But they weren't losing 5-1. They were achieving favorable kill ratios because their aircraft and training were superior. The Corsair exemplified this superiority in ways that were viscerally obvious. You couldn't rationalize away its advantages, couldn't maintain illusions about eventual victory when facing opponents who held every conceivable edge. The final months of the war saw Corsairs operating over German territory itself as Allied forces pushed into the Reich from all directions. British Fleet Air Arm squadrons flew from carriers in the North Sea, supporting operations against coastal targets. American Marine squadrons, having completed their Pacific campaigns, deployed to European bases and flew missions deep into German airspace. The appearance of Corsairs over German cities represented not just military defeat but the complete collapse of the protective barrier that had kept the homeland safe. German civilians, who had grown accustomed to Allied bomber streams and fighter sweeps, learned to recognize the Corsair's distinctive silhouette and sound. Air raid wardens could identify aircraft by their engine notes, necessary skill when every plane in the sky was hostile. The Corsair's howl became another of many terrors in the final chaotic months, but for Luftwaffe pilots, it remained the most psychologically devastating. It represented everything they couldn't match, couldn't counter, couldn't overcome through skill or courage or sacrifice. In January 1945, Jagdgeschwader 27 ceased to exist as a functional fighting unit. The squadron that Klaus Brenner had served with, that had once been among the elite units of the Luftwaffe, was dissolved after sustaining losses that made continued operations impossible. The surviving pilots were distributed to other units or reassigned to training duties. Brenner himself survived the war, one of the fortunate few, and in his post-war writings, he reflected on what had broken them. It wasn't just the superior numbers, though those were overwhelming. It wasn't just the better equipment, though that advantage was decisive. It was the psychological weight of knowing you were beaten before the fight began, that your courage and skill meant nothing against opponents who possessed every advantage. The last recorded encounter between Corsairs and German fighters occurred on April 26, 1945, 3 days before Hitler's suicide and 12 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. A flight of 4 FW-190s, piloted by teenagers with minimal training, intercepted a formation of British Corsairs near Hamburg. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. All 4 German aircraft were destroyed. The Corsairs returned to their carrier without damage. It was an unremarkable action in a war full of countless such encounters, notable only as a final statistical entry in the long record of German defeat. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.